The men laughed when the girl walked into the field carrying an armful of dead corn stalks instead of seed corn. Within 3 years, every one of those men would be standing in her driveway, begging her to tell them what she knew. Have you ever watched someone do something so strange that you were sure they'd lost their mind, only to find out later they were the only sane one in the room? That's exactly what happened in a dusty stretch of Finney County, Kansas, in the spring of 1955. Her name was Wren Calloway. 17 years old, dirt under her fingernails, and a stubbornness that ran 3 generations deep. Her grandfather, Silas Calloway, had farmed that same 160 acres since before the Dust Bowl tore the topsoil clean off half the county. He was the one who taught her something most farmers around them refused to believe, that dead plants weren't garbage. They were gold. Let's back up a little, because to understand what Wren did, you have to understand what almost destroyed her family's land 20 years earlier. In the 1930s, farmers across the Great Plains plowed their fields bare, turning under every scrap of stubble, every dead stalk, every root left behind after harvest. They wanted clean, tidy soil. Instead, they got the Dust Bowl, one of the worst man-made disasters in American history. Without anything holding the soil down, the wind picked it up and carried entire farms away in black clouds that blotted out the sun. Families lost everything. Some walked away from land their grandparents had settled. Silas Calloway was just a boy then, but he never forgot the taste of dust in his mouth, or the sight of his father standing in a doorway, watching his life blow away on the wind. So when he took over the farm, he did something different. He stopped clearing his fields bare after harvest. He left the dead stalks standing. He let the stubble lie where it fell. His neighbors thought he was lazy, or worse, foolish. But Silas wasn't being lazy. He was protecting his soil the way a mother protects a sleeping child, quietly and without needing anyone's approval. Now here's a question for you. What do you think happens to soil when you leave dead plant matter sitting on top of it, instead of stripping it bare? If you guessed that it helps hold moisture in the ground, you'd be exactly right. And that one simple idea is the secret at the heart of this entire story. By the time Wren was old enough to walk the fields beside her grandfather, Silas's hair had gone white, and his hands had gone stiff with arthritis. He couldn't kneel in the dirt the way he used to, so he taught her instead, crouching beside the rows, showing her how to check the soil under a layer of old stalks, compared to soil that had been plowed bare and left exposed to the sun. "Feel that," he told her one July afternoon, pressing her small hand into the ground beneath a mat of dead wheat stubble. The soil was cool and damp, even though the sun outside was merciless. Then he walked her 20 feet over to a neighbor's bare, plowed field and had her feel that soil too. It was hot, dry, crumbling like old bread. "Same sun," he said. "Same sky, same rain last week. So why is one wet and one dry?" Wren didn't have the answer yet, but she would. She spent her teenage years reading everything she could get her hands on about soil conservation, pamphlets from the county extension office, articles clipped from farm journals, anything that talked about what farmers now call stubble mulch farming or conservation tillage. The idea is simple once you understand it. Dead plant residue left on top of the soil acts like a blanket. It shades the ground from direct sun, which slows evaporation. It breaks the force of wind and rain, which prevents erosion. And as it slowly breaks down, it feeds nutrients back into the earth, building up organic matter that helps the soil hold even more water the next season. It's not magic, it's chemistry and physics working together, the same way they always have. But in 1955, most farmers in that part of Kansas still believed a clean, bare field after harvest was a sign of a proud farmer. Trash in the field, they called the leftover stalks, trash that needed to be burned or plowed under. So when Silas passed that spring, leaving the farm to his son, Wren's father, a quiet, tired man named Silas Calloway, there was pressure from the very first week to do things properly. Hollis wanted to keep his father's methods, but grief does strange things to a man's confidence, and the neighbors' whispering got louder every week. Wasteful, backwards. Somebody ought to tell that family how real farmers do it. That's when Wren stepped in. She was 17, still in high school, but she'd spent more hours studying that soil than most grown men in the county had spent studying anything in their lives. She told her father she wanted to plant the west 40 acres herself, using Silas's method exactly the way he'd taught her, leaving last season's dead corn stalks standing and unbroken, planting the new seed directly into the ground between them, instead of plowing the field bare first. Have you ever had to convince someone you loved that you knew what you were doing, even when your hands were shaking? That was Wren, standing in the kitchen, asking her exhausted father to trust a 17-year-old girl over an entire county of grown men. Hollis said yes, maybe because he was too tired to argue. Maybe because some small part of him remembered his own father's steady hands in that same dirt. Either way, he gave her the West 40. Wren's mother, a practical woman named Loretta, wasn't so easily convinced. She'd married into farming, not been born into it, and she'd watched enough seasons come and go to know how quickly pride could turn into ruin. The night before Wren was set to start planting, Loretta sat her down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and asked her, plainly, what she'd do if the whole county was right and she was wrong. "Then I'll have learned something," Wren said, "and so will they, just not the way they wanted." Loretta studied her daughter for a long moment. There was a stubbornness in Wren's face that reminded her painfully of Silas, and maybe that was what finally settled it. She didn't say yes outright. She just refilled Wren's coffee cup and told her to be out at the field by sunrise, because dead stalks don't plant themselves. That night, Wren barely slept. She kept running the numbers her grandfather had shown her years before. How much water evaporated from bare soil under a Kansas sun compared to soil shaded by residue. How many inches of rainfall a good stubble mat could effectively save over the course of a growing season. It wasn't guesswork, it was arithmetic, written in dirt instead of chalk. But arithmetic doesn't feel like much comfort when you're 17, and half the county is waiting for you to fail. Word travels fast in farm country, and it wasn't long before people were slowing their trucks down on the county road just to see the Calloway girl out there planting corn into a field that still had last year's dead stalks standing in it like a graveyard of brown skeletons. A neighbor named Otis Pruitt, who farmed the section just east of the Calloway land, stopped his truck one afternoon and leaned out the window. "You know that's not how it's done, don't you, girl?" he called out, not unkindly, but with the particular condescension of a man who'd farmed for 30 years, talking to someone who hadn't been alive for half of that. "Field needs to breathe, needs to be clean." Wren straightened up, wiped the sweat off her forehead, and said, "Soil doesn't need to breathe, Mr. Pruitt. It needs to drink, and this is how it stays thirsty the longest." He laughed and drove off, but he didn't forget what she said. That summer passed with ordinary rain, and the difference between Wren's field and everyone else's wasn't dramatic enough for anyone to notice much. The real test was still coming, and neither Wren nor anyone else in that county had any idea just how bad it was about to get. By 1956, Kansas was in the grip of one of the most severe droughts in the 20th century. Weeks turned into months without meaningful rain. The sky stayed a hard, merciless blue, day after day after day. Wells that had run steady for decades started to sputter. Cattle grew thin, and across the county, cornfields that had been plowed bare and clean the autumn before began to crack and curl, the stalks turning brown weeks before they should have, the yields dropping so low that some farmers didn't bother harvesting at all. Can you imagine watching an entire season of work, months of planting, tending, praying for rain, wither away in front of your eyes? That was the summer of 1956, for half the farmers in Finney County. But out on the Calloway land, something different was happening. Wren's field, planted into that mat of dead stalks and stubble, was holding on. Not thriving exactly. No field thrives in a drought that bad, but holding. The residue on top of the soil had done exactly what she and her grandfather had always believed it would. It had shaded the ground from the worst of the sun's heat. It had slowed the wind that dried out bare soil in hours. It had trapped what little moisture came from the sparse rains and refused to let it evaporate away. The soil beneath those dead stalks stayed cooler, stayed damper, for weeks longer than the soil in the bare, clean fields around it. The corn wasn't tall, it wasn't a bumper crop by any means, but it was alive, and it was producing, while entire sections of neighboring fields turned to dust and blew away exactly the way they had 20 years before, in the disaster that haunted every farmer old enough to remember it. There was a night that July when the wind picked up hard out of the southwest, the kind of wind that old-timers in that county still talked about in hushed voices because it reminded them of the black dusters that had swallowed whole towns a generation earlier. Wren stood on the porch with her father and watched a thin brown haze rise off Otis Pruitt's bare, freshly cultivated field, a half-mile east, drifting across the road like smoke from a fire that never went out. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Then she looked toward her own field, and the haze there was thinner, weaker, the residue on top holding the soil down, the way a hand holds down a blanket in a storm. Have you ever had a moment where you understood, all at once, that you'd been right about something that mattered? That was Wren's moment, standing on that porch in the dark, listening to the wind try and fail to take her family's soil away. Wells across the county kept dropping through the rest of that summer. Cattle prices sagged as ranchers sold off herds they couldn't feed. Church pews on Sunday morning had a few more empty seats each week, families quietly packing up and leaving for California or Arizona, the way so many had done in the 30s. It was, by nearly every account from people who lived through it, one of the hardest stretches Kansas farm country had seen since the Dust Bowl itself. And in the middle of all that hardship, a field planted by a teenage girl kept standing. This is the part of the story where I need you to pause for just a second. If you're finding this useful so far, do me a favor and hit that like button, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because we've got a lot more of Wren's story left, and I don't want you to miss what happens next. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know what city or town you're watching from today. I love seeing where all of you are tuning in from. Alright, back to the story. By August of 1956, the County Extension Office had gotten word of the strange little success story out on the Calloway farm. A man named Dale Whitfield, the local agricultural extension agent, drove out personally to see it for himself. Whitfield had spent years trying to convince farmers in the region to adopt better soil conservation practices, with limited success. Most were too set in their ways, too suspicious of anything that looked like it came from a government pamphlet. When he pulled up to the Calloway place and saw a field of stubble-mulched corn standing green and steady, while the rest of the county baked brown around it, he reportedly stood at the fence line for a long moment without saying a word. "Who planted this field?" he finally asked Hollis. "My daughter," Hollis said. Whitfield asked to meet her. And when Wren walked out to that fence line in her work boots and explained, calmly, clearly, without an ounce of the nervousness you might expect from a teenage girl talking to a county official, exactly why she'd left the old stalk standing and how the residue was protecting the soil's moisture, Whitfield later said it was one of the most articulate explanations of conservation tillage he'd ever heard from anyone of any age. Here's a question worth sitting with. Why do you think it took a teenage girl to get people listening to an idea the Extension Office had been trying to teach for years? Maybe it's because people believe what they can see with their own eyes more than what they read in a pamphlet. And what they saw, standing at that fence line in the worst drought in a generation, was undeniable. Wren's field was alive, theirs weren't. Word spread through the county faster than any pamphlet ever could have. Farmers who had laughed at Wren the year before started showing up at the Calloway place, hats in hand, asking questions they'd been too proud to ask before. Otis Pruitt was one of the first. He stood in that same field where he'd once told a 17-year-old girl she didn't know how farming was done, and he asked her, plainly, to show him what she'd done differently. Wren didn't gloat. Her grandfather hadn't raised her that way. She simply walked Otis through it, the same way Silas had once walked her through it, showing him the residue, explaining how it shaded and cooled the soil, how it slowed the evaporation that was baking his own fields dry, how the slow breakdown of the old stalks was feeding nutrients back into ground that his bare, clean fields had been starving for years. By the following planting season, Otis Pruitt was leaving stubble on his own fields for the first time in his farming life. So were half a dozen other farmers up and down that county road. Dale Whitfield started using the Calloway farm as a demonstration site for other extension agents from surrounding counties, teaching them the same principles Wren had learned, kneeling in the dirt beside her grandfather. What Wren had really discovered wasn't some secret trick nobody had ever heard of. Farmers and scientists had been documenting the value of residue-based soil conservation since the Dust Bowl years, and stubble mulch farming would go on to become a foundational practice in what we now call conservation tillage, a set of methods that reduces how much soil gets disturbed at harvest and planting time in order to protect it, hold moisture, and prevent erosion. Today, these principles are used on millions of acres across the United States, precisely because they work the way Silas Calloway believed they would, decades before most people were ready to listen. If you're watching this and you've got even a small garden, a backyard plot, or a working farm of your own, here's the takeaway you can actually use. Instead of clearing away every dead plant, every fallen leaf, every old stalk after harvest, consider leaving some of that organic material right where it falls. Chop it if you need to make it more manageable, but let it sit on top of the soil instead of hauling it away. That layer acts as a natural mulch, shading the ground from harsh sun, slowing water evaporation, protecting against wind and erosion, and slowly breaking down to feed the soil underneath. It's one of the simplest, cheapest forms of drought protection available to any grower, and it's been proven, field after field, decade after decade, since a girl named Wren Calloway first knelt beside her grandfather and asked why one patch of dirt stayed wet while another went dry. Wren Calloway went on to work alongside the county extension office for years afterward, teaching conservation methods to farmers across that part of Kansas. The field where it all started is still farmed by her family today, the soil beneath it richer and darker than it has any right to be, in a region that once lost its topsoil to the wind. Sometimes the biggest lessons in farming don't come from a textbook or an expert with a fancy title. Sometimes they come from a 17-year-old girl with dirt on her hands, dead sticks in her arms, and enough patience to wait for a drought to prove her right. If this story taught you something new today, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one, and if you enjoyed it, tap that like button before you go. And don't forget, drop a comment down below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. We'll see you in the next story.